Peter B. Collins News and Comment. It's Friday, June 22nd, 2018. It's been an ugly, dark week, dealing with Trump's concocted controversy at the border, the heartbreak of families being separated, the exposure of the immigrant detention facilities that we maintain across the United States. And I'm happy to say that there is a little bit of good news, and it's coming from an unlikely direction, the United States Supreme Court. Just yesterday, we were slamming the court with Greg Palast, talking about the crazy decision in the Houston case where they allow the state of Ohio to remove people, purge them from the voter rolls because they failed to vote in an election or two. And there's a lot of bad shit coming out of the Supreme Court, and there's more on the way because we're in the final weeks of the session, the annual cycle of the Supreme Court. But I'm delighted to say that the Chief Justice joined the alleged liberals on the bench in a very important decision, that the government generally needs a warrant to collect location data from your cell phone to use against you in a criminal prosecution. This is a major assertion of our Fourth Amendment rights, and it flies in the face of the cave-ins that we've seen about surveillance, about our privacy rights, about the data that's collected by the government and by commercial operators on our movements, our purchases, our interests, our web searches. So this 5-4 decision was written by the Chief Justice, and he said, we hold only that a warrant is required in the case where the suspect has a legitimate privacy interest in records held by a third party. Now, it's fair to say that this decision is limited. The Chief Justice, in his majority opinion, went on to say that this opinion doesn't consider collection techniques involving foreign affairs or so-called national security. And that's a loophole you can drive several Mack trucks through. But I want to be really clear here. I'm about to speculate. This decision leads me to believe that the current Supreme Court, if it were brought a case challenging the use of the Stingray dragnet collection system, that's the system deployed by the FBI and now used across the country by local law enforcement agencies. It was a tool in the war on terror that is now being used in all kinds of garden variety criminal investigations in this country. And I have sounded the alarm about Stingray over and over. I was one of the first to expose the government's use of this system. And I'll just explain briefly again that it simulates a local cell tower, and it basically tricks any phone within a certain radius, usually about 5 miles, to check in and dump information into Stingray, identifying the phone number, the serial number of the phone. Some of these boxes can access your voicemail, your contacts, but most critically, they can get your location. And I believe that Stingray is a violation of the Fourth Amendment unless it is used with a warrant based on probable cause and the issue of a court order. That's what we're guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. And this court found in a case from Michigan where a guy who was essentially the mastermind of a pretty sophisticated cell phone theft ring, a guy named Carpenter, Timothy Carpenter, was the mastermind. He planned the robberies, supplied guns, served as a lookout. He waited in a stolen car across the street from Radio Shack stores and other outlets that sold smartphones. And so this was a fairly sophisticated scheme. And cell phone companies turned over 127 days of his cell phone records that placed his phone at 12,000, almost 13,000 locations. And Justice Roberts said that mapping a cell phone's location over the course of 127 days provides an all-encompassing record of the holder's whereabouts. As with GPS information, the time-stamped data provides an intimate window into a person's life, revealing not only his particular movements, but through them his familial, political, professional, religious, and sexual associations. The justice appears to be carving out protection for cheaters. They have the right not to be exposed based on their cell phone data. So I think this is a very significant case, and Roberts has shown in past cases related to the planting of GPS devices surreptitiously on people's cars by law enforcement. That's not permitted under the Roberts rules. And also, in the case Riley versus California, the court required a warrant to search cell phones. So I think that this is a very important case. One more quote from Roberts' rule here, his ruling today. When the government tracks the location of a cell phone, it achieves near perfect surveillance, as if it had attached an ankle monitor to the phone's user. And by the way, this guy Carpenter got 116 years in prison. As far as I know, there were no murders or any other complications. These were simple property crimes that were conducted with guns drawn, which makes them more serious than just a burglary or something like that. But still, 116 years? Well, he'll get a retrial, and we'll see if they are able to use what's called parallel construction to convict him again without using the tainted data, now forbidden without a warrant by the U.S. Supreme Court. And now we turn to the tragedy that's been exposed by the overreach of Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions, the zero-tolerance policy that exposed the real cruelty. And for many Americans, cruelty is not a problem. If you listen to this podcast and you tend to share my worldview, you're probably not a fan of cruelty. But maybe you've seen some of the social media posts of people who are hardliners, who support what Trump is doing, and who taunt the pictures of children who are in cages, who talk about wanting to shoot all immigrants at the border. A lot of hate has been released. Trump gives the most despicable views that are harbored by Americans, license to be expressed. And we've seen just a flood of that kind of expression. But for me, this is not a silver lining, but this is a much overdue inspection of these gulags that are set up in the United States. Some are run by nonprofits, some are run by for-profit private prison companies, and some are run directly by the government. We're learning, for example, from a report at the New York Daily News, that at the Shenandoah Valley Juvenile Center in the state of Virginia, immigrant children were beaten, left naked in cells, strapped to chairs by guards. A federal court case brought on behalf of an unidentified 17-year-old boy from Mexico says that he spent time in San Antonio, then in New York, before he was sent to Virginia for alleged violent behavior. And he found that there were prison-like conditions at this residence facility. No privacy from guards to use the bathroom, only 1 hour of recreation time per day, and a lot of racist taunts like being called a Mexican monkey and physical hitting, as well as harsh punishments. Several immigrant detainees have reported being stripped of their clothes, occasionally including their underwear. One 15-year-old Honduran boy said that he'd been slammed against the ground and the wall after an argument over holding a door open. And another 15-year-old said he was restrained to a chair with a bag over his head. Now, the people who run the facility say, oh, these are just, corrective measures for bad behavior. But this, we know that they make excuses for maltreatment and punitive treatment when they are often confronted about it. So we're also hearing that Latino immigrant children were treated different from the juvenile detainees that are at the same center, who are largely white, and they got to play Xbox. But the brown kids were not permitted to do that. And more seriously, Huffington Post is reporting that staff working on behalf of the Office of Refugee Resettlement are routinely drugging detained child migrants with psychotropic medications without their parents' consent and without even explaining typically to the children why they are being drugged. One child reported taking up to 9 pills in the morning and another 7 in the evening without knowing what the medication was or why he was supposed to take it. A memo filed in the lawsuit says that the Office of Refugee Resettlement routinely administers children psychotropic drugs without lawful authorization. When youth object to taking such medications, they are compelled. And this is a very, very troubling situation. We understand that based on the Flores case, lawyers have gotten access to some of the medical records, and they see the use of these medications at all facilities where the government holds unaccompanied minors. And there have been some forced injections at a facility called Shiloh, which I believe is located in Texas. And also we see that many of these drugged children end up with massive side effects. Like this one kid identified as Julio Z. They told me if I didn't take the medicine, I could not leave. The only way I could get out of Shiloh was if I took the pills. And since he has been there just 2 months, Julio Z has gained 45 pounds. So, are they managing behavioral problems, PTSD, emotional and psychological issues of these incarcerated children with drugs that are not legally being prescribed or administered? It appears the answer is yes. And I hope we see further investigations. We need to see sanctions on the operators of these facilities for government-sponsored child abuse. It's beyond shameful. And we also have to address the issues in the adult lockups, where sex is traded for favors, where guards don't intervene when there are fights between prisoners, and a whole host of other violations of fundamental human rights right here in these United States. And it's been going on for years. It happened during the Obama administration. And finally, we're seeing a little daylight on these shadowy situations. California Congresswoman Jackie Speer is a Democrat from the Bay Area, the north end of Silicon Valley, and she was talking with some women who are concerned about these families that have been split up. And the DNA testing company owned by Ann Wojcicki, who I think was married to one of the Google founders, well, 23andMe, the DNA company, has agreed to provide DNA tests for the separated families and children. And on the face of it, I'm a little squirmy about this because I just don't know who will control the data. And it seems like we can reunite these families based on, other information without having them cough up their DNA, literally, by spitting in a tube. And then we don't know who will control that data and how it might be misused against these individuals in the future. And you've heard by now a fair amount about the Flores consent decree. This goes back to 1997 during the Bill Clinton administration. And a federal judge who has since passed away issued an order limiting the detention of migrant families and independent migrant minors to no more than 20 days. And that consent decree is now under the management of a tough judge, a federal judge in Los Angeles, who has a name that people will make fun of because it rhymes with golly gee. Her name is Dolly M.G. Her last name is spelled G-E-E. And she was appointed to the federal bench by Obama in 2009, the daughter of Chinese immigrants, her dad an aerospace engineer, her mother was a garment worker. And when she was appointed to the court, then Senator Boxer noted that Judge G's mother was a garment worker who never taught Dolly to sew because she didn't want her daughter to have to stitch clothes for a living. Now, Judge G was really tough on the Obama administration for family incarceration issues. And Going back a few years, her previous rulings of limited federal detentions of migrant families have been critical of conditions in which border agents hold detainees. In 2015, in a case addressing the detention of families, not the separation of children, she ordered the Obama administration to release children and their parents without unnecessary delay, and ruled that the Flores settlement be applied to all children in detention, no matter how they arrived at the border. So, the Trump administration, through Attorney General Jeffrey Beauregard Jim Crow Sessions III, it's Jefferson, pardon me, Jefferson Beauregard. I sometimes screw that up when I try to make fun of the guy. Anyway, he has already filed a brief with Judge G asking her to review the consent decree and allow this administration to lock people up as a family indefinitely. And there are serious problems with that idea, as are exposed in an op-ed published in the New York Times today under the byline of immigrant advocate Sonia Nazario. The headline reads, "We're trading kids in cages for families in cages." And this op-ed, which I'm linking to in the show file for today's podcast, lays out good arguments about why children should not be jailed with or without their parents, and the psychological impact, the fact that many of these immigrant children coming from Honduras, El Salvador, or Guatemala have already experienced violence, the loss of a family member, gang intimidation, rape. About 6 in 10 girls who journey northward to the United States through Mexico, 6 in 10 are raped on the journey north. Thousands of Central Americans are kidnapped each year in Mexico. Girls are prostituted. Boys are enslaved. Migrants are killed. Their organs are harvested. And she notes this is the journey that President Trump yesterday said was like walking through Central Park. And so the writer of this op-ed goes on to say that we cannot improve family detention. You cannot fix it. Just don't do it at all. But she says there are lower-cost options, and she stresses the lower cost to try to get the attention of current Republican leaders. She said there's a family case management program started in 2016, allowed families seeking asylum to be released together with a very high rate of return when they are called to court. It was implemented with 700 families. 99% of the immigrants showed up for their hearings. And it only cost $36 a day, compared with $900 a day to lock up an immigrant parent with 2 children. She also notes other alternatives to prison like, electronic ankle bracelets that cost 30 cents to $8 per person per day. So when Trump says there's no other choice, you know he's lying. And we learned from a fact check of his mob rally in Duluth the other night that he was pumping out the lies at the rate of 1 every 2 minutes over the course of his hours-long ramble. And I'm inviting you to revisit a podcast or perhaps listen for the first time as we grapple with these serious immigration and detention of immigrant issues. And in December of 2016, I released an in-depth interview with Richard Cahan. He was the former photo editor at the Chicago Sun-Times, and he's the co-editor of a book. I wish I could show it to you right here. It's called Un-American, The Incarceration of Japanese Americans During World War II. And it is a thick book full of really emotional photos, some taken by Ansel Adams and Dorothy Lang, and they really show the ugly history of American racism during World War II as it was applied to Japanese Americans. And here is the excerpt from that interview with Richard Cahan, where he addresses the Japanese internment and, in December of 16, the looming Muslim registry that was being proposed by members of the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that makes this book so relevant today. There's already been talk by Trump supporters that the incarceration, or they wouldn't use the word incarceration, they use the word internment, is is the precedent for the Muslim registry, the idea of having Muslims register. I agree with him, but it's a bad precedent. And all you have to do is look at this book and understand how wrong it was. You can argue that security measures might have been necessary. The war was a very frightful time. But the one thing that I don't think you can argue was that what we did was un-American. And I think that the moment you separate Americans and you say to some Muslims, you have to register and you people don't have to register, that's an un-American act, because we are the society of people mixed together. And once you start separating us, it's just not who we are as a democracy. And I think you can really see that from this book, what can happen. And it happens, it happens so quickly. There was the United States government in the 1980s really studied the incarceration, and they came up with 3 reasons for it. One was war hysteria that we talked about, and one was a real racist feeling against Japanese, and the third one was the role of a lack of leadership. And those are things that you have to look out for very carefully.
That is Richard Cahan, the former photo editor of the Chicago Sun-Times and co-editor of Un-American, the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. If you do a Google search, in fact, you could find it through the link at my podcast. And in today's show file, I'll put up a link to that in-depth interview. And when you find the text that's associated with it, there is a link there that can take you to the website for the book. And I know that there were some photos there taken from the book that might be valuable for you to look at. One of the questions that I give credit to the corporate media for opening up is, why do they keep coming? And with this cruelty telegraphed around the world, is it the deterrent effect that Trump and Sessions are hoping for? And the answer to that is no, because conditions are so dire, particularly in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, that even facing family separation and the requirement of 2 or 3 attempts to get across the border, there are many people still willing to take that risk. And at Consortium News today, Joseph Nevins writes a piece about the U.S. role in destabilizing Honduras. You go back to 2009, Obama was in office, Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, the Zelaya government had finally taken power and was trying to deal with the legacy of oligarchs and U.S. banana diplomacy. They were trying to redistribute wealth. And the U.S. supported a coup against Zelaya in which he was hustled out of the country, and Hillary Clinton went to great efforts to keep him out of the country so they could run a quick election and rig it to elect his successor. And this has led to the conditions in Honduras today. We have a role, a responsibility. Organized crime, drug traffickers, and the country's police heavily overlap. Impunity reigns in a country with frequent politically motivated killings. It's the world's most dangerous country for environmental activists, according to Global Witness. And although its once sky-high murder rate has declined, the continuing exodus of many youth demonstrates that violent gangs still plague urban neighborhoods. Meanwhile, post-coup governments have intensified an increasingly unregulated, quote-unquote, free market form of capitalism that makes life unworkable for many. And Trump thinks you can just seal this off with a wall at the southern border. And he's shifting money from the Coast Guard to cover the costs of detention of migrants who have been captured. The Coast Guard is one of the most effective ways of interdicting drugs and human trafficking approaching the United States. And to shift that money is just another irrational move by our thin-skinned and barely rational president. And Trump got on Twitter today and once again roiled the scene on Capitol Hill, where Republicans left town for the weekend without taking a vote on the so-called compromise immigration bill, which would still provide money for the wall and a lot of other very draconian measures. Well, Trump's tweet? It's a risky bet. Republicans should stop wasting their time on immigration until after we elect more senators and congressmen women in November. Dems are just playing games, have no intention of doing anything to solve this decades-old problem. We can pass great legislation after the red wave. Now, that's a play on the media meme about a possible blue wave of Democrats. Now, this cuts in two ways because the GOP is split. It's the Republicans who cannot come together. They've got a majority in the House, but they can't pass a bill. And Trump tries to blame the Democrats, who are really just onlookers in this food fight. Now, there are two other considerations. One is, if the Democrats manage the uphill struggle to regain control of the House in November, well, it could be because of this immigration issue. And this might actually be the issue that unites Democrats and gets them to turn out in November. Also, regardless of which party prevails in the midterm elections, there will be a lame duck session between November and December. And that is a vulnerable place where a bad piece of immigration legislation could be rammed through, including funding for that damn wall. Now we'll look at the optics of the coverage this week. Time magazine has a cover that is going viral in social media. It shows Trump standing and looking down at a little girl. And the picture of the little girl has been used to raise millions of dollars on Facebook this week to support these separated immigrant families. And the Washington Post is dinging Time magazine because, in fact, the girl in the picture was never separated from her mother. Now, the cover doesn't indicate that. It just says, "Welcome to America," and it shows Trump with this girl. But we can expect that the dear tweeter and his allies are going to rip this apart and say, fake news, corporate media, the media hates Trump. But there was never any clear allusion made by Time magazine that this girl had been separated from her parent. So be prepared for a barrage about that. And also, even as I said it yesterday, I had regrets in the podcast. I broke one of my own rules and I commented on Melania Trump's fashion selection for her trip to the child prison in Texas. But I had not seen her entire wardrobe for the day, including that $39 jacket from Zara that on the back says, "I don't really care, do you?" And I'm not going to try to decipher what Melania meant by choosing to wear this jacket. Trump tweeted out that even though the First Lady's office said it was only a jacket, no message intended, Trump claimed that she was sending a message. Let's see, he says, Melania has learned how dishonest the fake news media are, and she truly no longer cares. Now, we don't know if she agrees with her aging husband's interpretation of that, and frankly, I don't care. But I've learned my lesson, and I will refrain from commenting on Melania's wardrobe in the future. Kevin Gosztola broke the story late yesterday. Reality Winner's mother has announced that the NSA leaker, whistleblower, will be accepting a plea agreement in court on July 26th because the government, using the Espionage Act, created a case where she cannot defend herself. Some 40 of 41 subpoena requests for records by the defense were rejected by the judge. Arguments of intent don't matter in an Espionage Act case, and she is facing a crippling prison sentence one way or the other. John Kiriakou, who's been through the ringer of the Espionage Act, says it's disgraceful that she's been kept in prison for more than a year. It's actually unprecedented in cases like this. Every other national security defendant who's been identified as a whistleblower in the last decade was either released on their own recognizance or released under very favorable bail terms. The fact that she was kept incarcerated for a year is unfair and was unnecessary. And the fact that The Intercept, responsible for burning the whistleblower who leaked a document to The Intercept, and its producer and reporter Matthew Cole, who has burned John Kiriakou and Joe Hickman, and now Reality Winner. He took her document to the government to get it confirmed, and that's what gave them the evidence, the watermark, to finger her as the suspect. Will The Intercept ever own up to it? I don't know. A few things going on in Washington while we've been distracted by the immigration imbroglio. House Republicans released a budget proposal that they know will never pass. So take it as a warning, but not yet a threat. They want to make deep cuts to Medicare, to Medicaid, and they want to rejigger Social Security. Now, as we said, this is not going anywhere at this time. But because they've run up the deficit with the tax cuts and their own annual budget deficit of over $1 trillion, the Republicans now feel that they've got to get a hold of their fiscal discipline, and they want to take it out on the so-called entitlement programs that are not really a part of the congressional budget. The House passes a farm bill. The Senate may pass one next week, and the big difference between the two is the House version has punitive new rules about who can get food stamps, or what's now called SNAP. And because wages are flat, it's the working poor, people who work at Walmart, are heavy users of the SNAP program. It's a huge subsidy to agribusiness in this country. But this is the stern father Republican cracking down on the takers. And we'll see if the Senate joins the House in these punitive measures that also have greater work requirements. The Trump trade war is spinning out of control. The European Union fought back today with $3.5 billion worth of tariffs. Well, it's tariffs on $3.5 billion worth of goods. And Trump is he's threatening to place a 20% tariff on European cars. And apparently somebody hasn't told him that Mercedes and BMW build most of the cars that they sell in the United States right here in the U.S. of A. And, for example, Volvo, which owns a Mack truck plant in Pennsylvania, Allentown, now has to pay a 25% tariff on the steel that it imports to build Mack trucks in the United States. They can't get it here. And Trump imagines that steel mills are going to fire up tomorrow to close this gap. But all it means is that workers are going to be laid off at Volvo's Mack truck plant in Pennsylvania when they can't get the steel, or when it becomes too pricey and sales decline as a result. And Vice News does a decent job today of showing how, despite Trump's claim that the trade war is to put the American worker first, the American worker is going to be first to feel the higher prices coming from this trade war and the tit-for-tat tariffs. So Mexico is going to be targeting bourbon from Kentucky, pork, steel, cheese, and the countries that are fighting back are targeting states with Republican leaders. So they want to go after steel from Mike Pence's home state of Indiana, motorboats from Marco Rubio's Florida, and agricultural products from the California district of Kevin McCarthy. But unfortunately, California is a big state, and Kevin McCarthy doesn't represent all of the agricultural zones here. I'll mention in passing that Trump has unveiled a plan to merge the Labor Department into the Education Department. And I'll say just in general that I'm not opposed to reconfiguring the federal government. But the plans they have involve subterfuge aimed at cutting safety net programs and important programs that help low-income Americans. And this is one of those maneuvers that I think is dead on arrival, because all of these changes require congressional approval, and it is the chair of the committees that are related to the cabinet agencies who will not give up their turf. That's my prediction. I think it's going nowhere. And America's charming National Security Advisor, John Bolton, has been dispatched to Moscow by the president to line him up a meeting with Vladimir Putin. That's going to be a fun one. That should be coming in the next few weeks. And this comes at a time when Putin has made deals with China for end runs on Trump's trade war with China and other countries. And it'll be interesting, to say the least. Hey, thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You made it all the way to the bitter end. We post this on YouTube, and I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.